Hello and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT ranked meta video. Our analysts are here to go through the 11-18 meta for each stage of the game. We'll be covering each aspect of the meta, including stages, items, and compositions. The meta heavily favored the mid-game until the B patch, where it now feels evenly split between lost cost compositions and late-game comps. There's a lot to cover, so let's go ahead and get started. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come. Be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Before we start delving into each stage of the game, let's first take a step back and look at the overall meta for patch 11-18. We'll touch on the specific meta comps later, but for now, let's take a look at the broad overview of how the meta formed. Due to the original 11-18 patch, quite a few aspects of the meta have changed. Several compositions that were doing well received nerfs, particularly ones utilizing Galio and Revenants, and one champion in particular was buffed, Yasuo. A combination of all the changes led to the meta shifting away from the late game and 4-cost carry comps to a mid-game focus with reroll builds. Champions like Yasuo, Vayne, and Kha'Zix dominated the initial week of the patch, increasing the pace of the game to the point where anyone playing to level 8 quickly was often at quite a major disadvantage. This also paved the way for Assassins to do well, as they've been one of the best mid-game synergies for most of Set 5. Naturally, this led to a B patch which nerfed most of those champions, as well as a severe nerf to 6 Assassin. From there, this helped even out the meta slightly to where it is now. The pace of the game is still mid-game oriented, especially since Kha'Zix and Yasuo are still plenty strong, but the late game did open up. Primarily, we've seen AD compositions as the preferred playstyle, though AP isn't completely dead. All in all, the pace of the game went up a few gears in 11-18, and while the B patch did slow it down once again, it is still heavily focused around stages 3, 4, and the early rounds of 5. With a brief overview of what the meta is, let's begin deconstructing each stage of the game, beginning with the early game. And as usual, the first part of the early game to discuss is the opening carousel. Items are still quite flexible for the mid-set, as there's plenty of options, whether defensive, offensive, or utility. What this means is that a lot of the time the component you get from the carousel is down to player preference. Are you the type of player that focus on playing flex? Or maybe you want to hard force a specific comp like an AP or AD one. Maybe you're still someone leaning into reroll compositions, in which case you want components that are essential to those builds. Whichever way you lean, the two major decisions regarding component priority are whether you want to play flexibly to leave options open or instead prefer playing AD or AP. Playing flexibly means having components that make all-around useful items that can be slammed for any composition. Generally, this means defensive items like Bramble Vest, Sunfire Cape, Warmogs, or Stone Plate. Any defensive item is key to playing flex because you can tailor the rest of your items towards a more defined role later on in the game once you've had time to piece together a cohesive comp. And in the early game, defensive items are by far the best way to either win or mitigate damage loss. This is because damage is so low for early boards that frontline champions become crazy efficient with defensive items. As such, for flex play, that means the two best components are Chain Vest and Belt. If you'd rather focus on AD comps, which are the dominant type of composition in the meta, then Sword, Bow, and Glove are the choice for you. Sword makes into most of the AD-centric items like Deathblade, Bloodthirster, and Infinity Edge. Bow is useful for Rage Blade, Last Whisper, and occasionally Titan's Resolve or Runan's Hurricane. Glove is secondary for Infinity Edge and Last Whisper, but also opens up the door for a key flex item, Hand of Justice. While AP comps are much less common, they are still viable. That means prioritizing Tear or Rod is ideal, specifically the Tear. Tear goes towards mana items like Shojin or Blue Buff, which are often essential items for AP carries like Vel'Koz, Heimerdinger, and Karma. Rod is just the catch-all component for AP items like Deathcap, Jeweled Gauntlet, and Archangel Staff. That leaves one last component, Cloak. Cloak isn't terrible, but there's no real reason to prioritize it over any other component. Plus, having multiple cloaks is often a downside, though Dragon's Claw is a useful item for frontliners, particularly if anyone in the lobby ends up running Karma. Let's now move on into the stages of the game, starting with Stage 1. The only major change in Stage 1 compared to the previous meta is that reroll comps are still doing well. That means you want to keep an eye out for multiples of specific champions, as that opens the door for rerolling for them. The strongest are Gragas and Kha'Zix for the chug compositions, but Vayne is also still up there despite the nerfs. Besides those, Ziggs with Hellions and Spellweaver is a viable option, as well as a Sentinel off-meta reroll build with Senna or Olaf. Otherwise, the goal of Stage 1 is to buy pairs, look for strong synergies, and aim to play your strongest board. On to Stage 2, where ideally, you want to be starting a win streak. Win streaking is the best way to play the early game because it builds up your economy and saves you health. Saving health as much as possible is key to doing well, making the early stages of the game far more important than the later. That means you want to learn what the strongest options are in Stage 2. The basic idea is to look for a good item holder and put together a board that plays around them. For example, Riven. Riven may fall off later into the game, but early on, she's one of the best carries. Play her by adding in Dawnbringer and Legionnaire, and your board will be in a good spot. Other key champions for the early game are Yasuo, Nidalee, Varus, Kalista Aatrox, Ziggs, Gragas Kha'Zix, and the ever-reliable Sentinel Skirmisher opener. The other aspect of Stage 2 is leveling to stay on curve with the rest of the lobby. What that means is, if most players are leveling to 4 on 2-1, try 2 as well. If not 2-1, then do on 2-2 instead. Same thing with level 5 on 2-5. It's especially important to level if you want to maintain a win streak, as leveling is the easiest way to add extra strength to your board. There's 2 instances where leveling isn't recommended. One is when your board is clearly too weak to win, meaning you're stuck with a bunch of 1-star champions and no good early items to slam. In that case, play to lose as little health as possible, but aim for a loss streak until Krugs. The other reason to not level is when you have a good opener for a reroll comp, as the goal there is to save up as much gold as possible to slow roll after Krugs. There isn't much else to discuss for Stage 2, so let's shift over to the mid-game, starting with Stage 3. Stage 3 is where the pace of the game picks up, as 3-cost champions are a lot more common. Once again, the top 3 item holders are Yasuo, Nidalee, and Riven, but Nunu is also a worthwhile investment for Abomination. A-Bomb is the best and almost only way to play an AP board later on. By no means should you force it if you don't have a good opener for Abomination, but keep it in mind if your items lean more towards AP than AD. Make sure to level 6 on 3-2 unless you're re-rolling. Rolling to stabilize is important to do, but make sure you're scouting and keeping track of who you've played against. Knowing your relative power level compared to the whole lobby is key in Stage 3, as saving as much gold as you can helps a lot going into Stage 4. To stabilize, roll with the intent to either upgrade your existing item holder or buy a new one, preferably a 3-cost. Upgrade a few frontline champions as well and play a cohesive board. Before we move into Stage 4, there's Radiant items on 3-6 to mention. Overall, we can't recommend anything specific because the 5 items in each game are random. The general idea is to either pick an item that fills a hole in your existing comp, such as defensive Radiant item when you have a lot of carry items already, or get an item for your potential carry. The other option is picking up a utility item like Radiant Banshees or Radiant Shroud, as they're all around the best Radiant items. Let's move on to Stage 4, where the lobby will be leveling to 7 on 4-1 and rolling. Ideally, you don't want to roll too much on level 7 unless you're playing a board that spikes in this stage. This generally means a 3-cost carry composition, specifically Yasuo. In general, the goal with Stage 4 is to roll and find a few 4-cost champions that fit with your board. If you're playing AP, look for Vel'Koz unless you've hit quite a few Dawnbringer champions, in which case you can play Karma. AD carries are Aphelios, Lucian, Jax, and Draven, but all of them except for Jax struggle in Stage 4 unless you high roll and 2-star them early. Overall, Stage 4 is where a lot of health will be lost for most players, as 3-cost compositions will spike and reroll boards will come online with their 3-star units. Minimize damage by upgrading your existing champions and scouting to see what other players hit. The rest of Stage 4 is aimed at building your economy enough to level to 8 sometime in Stage 5, unless your economy has been amazing all game and you can level in Stage 4 instead. Before we enter the late game, let's take a look at a few of the meta compositions. For reroll comps, the main options are still either Chug Jug or Chug Bug. Kha'Zix is a bit weaker, but is still viable. Just keep in mind that Chug Bug will be outscaled. The Gragas-only version of the Chug composition has better options since you can play around the mid to late game carries. Vayne, Ziggs, and a few other reroll comps are all playable, with Ziggs and Vayne being the only semi-consistent boards. For 3 costs, Yasuo is still doing well, especially in the mid game. With Yasuo, the goal is mostly Nightbringers with a few Legionnaires sprinkled in. Give him items like Runaan's Hurricane, RFC, Jeweled Gauntlet, or Hand of Justice, and aim to roll for Yasuo 3, beginning in Stage 4 at level 7. Riven and Nidalee aren't particularly good late game as carries, though Riven can be if you can 3-star her. Instead, use them as mid-game item holders. Nocturne took a huge hit, making Assassins a lot weaker overall post-B patch. The only other 3 costs worth mentioning is Nunu, either with Re-Nunu or Abomination. Re-Nunu is a reroll composition with a Renewer emblem on Nunu 3. It's difficult to pull off, but can be quite strong. For Abomination, Vel'Koz is the main carry alongside defensive items for the Abomination champions. Heimerdinger is a viable late game option, but keep in mind a Heimerdinger 1 is borderline useless. To play him, you must have Shojin, Invoker, and he needs to be level 2. Vel'Koz can also be played with Spellweaver Redeemed, but the main way to play him is with Abomination. Karma is the other main AP option and is primarily played with Dawnbringer. This leaves us with a bunch of AD comps. Aphelios Ranger can be good, but is a costly comp that requires level 8. Akshan can also be a replacement late game carry for both Rangers and Sentinels. Sentinels with Galio Lucian are back to doing well after the B patch, but Lucian can have difficulties with scaling. Draven is still on the fringe of being a viable option in the meta, but can do well enough with 4 Legionnaire, 4 Knight. The last viable options are focused more towards the late game. From stage 5 and on, we're moving into the late game where you want to be leveling to 8 sometime between 4-5 and 5-3 unless you're playing a reroll comp. Level 8 is where most mid to late game compositions come online, so begin filling your comp with 4 and 5 cost champions. There's quite a few 5 cost champions worth investing into. Both Kayle and Akshan can be used as AD carries, with Heimerdinger being alright for AP, though he needs good items and level 2. Garen pairs with Dawnbringer, and Volibear pairs with Ivern for Revenant, which is still doing well despite the nerfs. Viego is all around useful late game, as is Gwen. Teemo is by far the best 5 cost champion since his ability counters AD boards, but since he costs health, it can be difficult to buy him. Overall, the late game is mainly about scouting and positioning. The main focus of your economy will be on upgrading your existing board, as level 9 is rarely worth the gold investment. That said, if you're winning a lot of rounds, you can always save gold to level 9, just don't expect to do this in most games. Focus your attention to scouting, positioning, and doing well in the earlier stages of the game. Doing that will improve your late game drastically, regardless of what comp you end up playing. And that's going to be it for today's video, folks. Patch 11.18 has had its ups and downs, but it seems to be landing in a good place near the end of it. Ideally, the next few patches should go back to evening out the meta instead of causing huge swings like we had in the first week of the patch. Let us know in the comment section below what you're looking forward to in patch 11.19. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.